House Democrats on the Oversight Committee released a handful of Jeffrey Epstein's emails that raised new questions about the relationship between the convicted sex offender and President Donald Trump. In one email, Epstein claimed that Trump, quote, knew about the girls. In another, Epstein said to his longtime associate Ghislaine Maxwell that the, quote, dog that hasn't barked is Trump. He added that an unnamed victim, quote, spent hours at my house with Trump, and Maxwell responded that, quote, I have been thinking about that. Republicans have said that the victim, whose name was redacted, is Virginia Giuffre, who has never accused the president of wrongdoing and wrote in her memoir that when she met him, he couldn't have been friendlier. Republicans on the Oversight Committee accused Democrats of cherry-picking emails that would, quote, generate clickbait, and then released an additional 20,000 documents. In these various emails, Epstein described Trump as borderline insane, worse in real life, and claimed, quote, I've met some very bad people, none as bad as Trump, not one decent cell in his body. Seemingly in response to the newly released emails, President Trump posted on Truth Social that, quote, the Democrats are using the Jeffrey Epstein hoax to try and deflect from their massive failures, in particular their most recent one, the shutdown. Coincidentally, on the same day, a discharge petition secured enough signatures to force a House vote on a bill that would compel the Trump administration to release all files related to Epstein. Barry Levine, author of The Spider, Inside the Criminal Web of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, has been investigating the deceased sex offender since the mid-2000s, and he joins Forbes True Crime to discuss what he's learned from the emails. Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, one of the hosts of Forbes True Crime. Joining me once again is Barry Levine. He has been covering Jeffrey Epstein for years, and he investigated him in his book called The Spider. Barry, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Brittany, once again.
I want to talk about some bombshells that we learned regarding convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The House Oversight Committee released a trove of emails where convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein mentions President Donald Trump by name, and I want to read and talk about some of the more headline-grabbing ones. In one, Epstein said that President Trump, quote, knew about the girls. And then in another, where Epstein was writing his partner in crime, accomplice, and convicted sex offender Ghislaine Maxwell, he said that Trump, quote, spent hours at my house with a victim, and the White House and House Republicans later said that that victim was Virginia Giuffre. So to start off the conversation, what do the new emails tell us?
Brittany, I have to tell you, after covering this story for years and years, yesterday was one of the most impactful days that I can ever recall, because it finally gave us a perspective. It really took us kind of behind the walls of the mansion to actually hear in Jeffrey Epstein's words his true connection to Donald Trump. And a lot of the emails that we read over that were passed on from Jeffrey Epstein's estate to the Oversight Committee were extremely troubling in terms of how long did Donald Trump know about Jeffrey Epstein's involvement with underage girls. When did that start? When did Donald Trump finally say he had enough? And of course, most troubling of all from these emails was is the question: did Donald Trump participate in any of this? Up to this point, he's never been charged with any wrongdoing. Or thus far, as we know, he's never been the subject specifically of a criminal investigation into his connection with Jeffrey Epstein. But I have to tell you, Brittany, that these emails change everything.
I want to talk about exactly what they change, exactly what they reveal about President Trump, because in your book, you talk about this over decade-long friendship between President Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. Both of them are these outer borough New York guys. And I want to quote your book. You say this: out of all of Epstein's past associates, Trump has the most to lose and perhaps the most to want to hide. And I asked you about that quote over the summer. You said you still believe it. And you also told me this, that it is disturbing that we are continuing to learn new details about the depth of their relationship. You're saying that these emails change everything. We learned a lot about President Trump. What did you learn about President Trump based on these emails?
Well, what I learned was, going back to 2011, at that particular period of time, Donald Trump was moving on from The Apprentice into politics. He was making comments about President Obama and his birther conspiracies. So he was becoming much larger on the national stage. Now, also at that time of a particular email that Jeffrey Epstein wrote, Virginia Giuffre, who had been Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's sex slave for 4 years, came out for the very first time in an interview in the London Sunday Mail, where she disclosed that she had been recruited from Trump's Mar-a-Lago and taken around the world by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and was forced into sexual abuse at the hands of some of Jeffrey Epstein and Maxwell's rich and powerful individual friends, including Prince Andrew, who, of course, has denied those allegations. However, at the time of that interview, she didn't have anything negative to say about Donald Trump, and she never accused him of wrongdoing. But we have a specific email from Jeffrey Epstein to Maxwell where he talks about the dog that hasn't barked is Trump. And that is in essence to the fact that nothing has been heard about him, or he hasn't said anything about this scandal. And Epstein acknowledges to Maxwell that he spent hours in his house with the victim, who the White House has said is indeed Virginia Giuffre. Now, while she hasn't never accused Trump of any wrongdoing, it is particularly questionable as to what Donald Trump was doing with her for hours in Jeffrey Epstein's home. At the time, she was 17 years old. Now, Maxwell responds to this email a few hours later and said that she is wondering about that too. Now, what does she mean by that? She was recently interviewed by Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General down in Florida, as she is making an effort to get clemency and a pardon from President Trump after her conviction for sex trafficking of minors. You have to wonder, why didn't Todd Blanche raise that email and question her about that? So there's a cover-up of some sort, I believe, that's taking place here. And it is very disturbing. And then there's some additional emails that he sent to an author here in New York, Michael Wolff, who really went above and beyond from being a book author and an interview subject to where he was giving advice to Jeffrey Epstein in terms of attempting to take down Donald Trump with information that Jeffrey Epstein had. Jeffrey Epstein, in those emails, talks about the fact that, of course, Trump knew about the girls. He asked Ghislaine to stop. There's also an email that Jeffrey Epstein emailed himself, maybe to put this on the record, thinking that the feds were closing in, where he said, Donald Trump knew about all this, although he never had a massage. So we're seeing for the first time in black and white from Jeffrey Epstein the depths of Donald Trump's involvement in their friendship and the fact of what his conduct was while Jeffrey Epstein was involved in this sex trafficking ring for 2 decades.
I want to hit on literally everything that you just said, but let's first start with Michael Wolff, an author, a journalist. Those emails were egregious. He was essentially consulting a sex offender, and I want to read them because I have them full just so no one loses context here. This is what he says. He says, "I hear CNN planning to ask Trump tonight about his relationship with you, either on air or in scrum afterwards." That's what Wolff said to Epstein. And Epstein said, "If we were able to craft an answer for him, what do you think it should be?" Wolff then responds, "I think you should let him hang himself. If he says he hasn't been on the plane or to the house, then that gives you a valuable PR and political currency. You can hang him in a way that potentially generates a positive benefit for you, or if it really looks like he could win, you could save him, generating a debt. Of course, it is possible that, when asked, he'll say Jeffrey is a great guy and has gotten a raw deal and is a victim of political correctness, which is to be outlawed in the Trump regime." Wolff responded to those emails yesterday. It seemed like he was embarrassed by them. And he said that essentially Epstein was afraid to publicly say about anything about Donald Trump. Do you think that's true?
Well, I mean, the record shows that after Trump was elected for his first term, it seems that Jeffrey Epstein was emailing a lot of individuals talking about information he had on Donald Trump and also critiquing uh, different things that Donald Trump was doing in his administration. He even wrote an email to a Norwegian official in advance of Donald Trump's first meeting with Vladimir Putin, in which he said that he could provide insight for Putin and the Russians into Donald Trump. So Jeffrey Epstein was certainly, it seems to me, becoming a major problem for Donald Trump behind the scenes because he was talking about his character with very important people through these emails and certainly putting it out there to individuals that he had the goods on Donald Trump. However, as far as we know, Jeffrey Epstein never acted on that in terms of giving an interview or stating anything publicly. But all of this information is disturbing in the sense that it really shows that despite Donald Trump's previous statements that he knew nothing about Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking, that these emails seem to draw Donald Trump much closer into the web, particularly in terms of spending time at Jeffrey Epstein's home, spending time around some of the underage girls. There's a disturbing email that Jeffrey Epstein wrote to a financial reporter and friend at the New York Times, in which he said, "I have photos of Donald Trump in my kitchen with girls in bikinis. Would you like those photos?" So what went on behind the scenes at Jeffrey Epstein's mansions in New York and Florida is now beginning to be crystallized to some degree. And we're seeing that Donald Trump's involvement with Jeffrey Epstein appears to be much deeper than Trump has acknowledged.
And House Democrats released the emails that said, of course, he knew about the girls, meaning Trump knew about the girls, and then that Trump spent hours with a victim in Epstein's house. Republicans said that they were being cherry picked and they released their own emails of Epstein. And in emails released yesterday, Epstein also called President Trump dirty. He said, "I know how dirty Donald is." He called Trump borderline insane, worse in real life and up close. I mean, what do you think was overall the most damning thing you saw? Because I know you said it reveals that layer, but does it really implicate President Trump in any wrongdoing?
Well, we don't know specifically the context of all these particular emails. And that's why it's so important that we need to have access. And the American public, not only Jeffrey Epstein's victims, and there's over 1,000 victims, but the American public needs to see the full transparency of the Epstein files. There's over 100,000 pages of documents that the government is sitting on. And I'm told that there are not just hundreds, but maybe more than 1,000 references to Donald Trump in those files that the government is refusing to release. That right now, of course, there may be a vote on next week, the discharge petition to get those files released. So we need to see, we're seeing little pieces of the puzzle right now. We need to see the overall context. And I'm very much for redacting names of victims, redacting names of third parties who are not necessarily involved in the sex trafficking. But the references to the sitting president of the United States should be made completely transparent to the American public so we can see exactly if Donald Trump was ever accused by any victims or other individuals of any type of specific wrongdoing. And the other thing that we learned from these emails, it does raise questions in that particular email related to Donald Trump spending hours with Virginia inside Epstein's home. He also references the police chief in that email, and that would be Michael Reiter. who had been the police chief in Palm Beach, Florida, at the time of the very first Epstein investigation in 2004. It begs the question. That was the year that Donald Trump said he had the falling out with Jeffrey Epstein, that Jeffrey Epstein was plucking girls from Mar-a-Lago Spa and taking them to work for him. We were also aware of a real estate deal that both men were chasing in Palm Beach. It raises questions to me. Jeffrey Epstein throws out the words police chief. Did he believe that Donald Trump may have provided information about him to that investigation? This is something that we don't know, and we need to hear from the authorities in Palm Beach as to what was Trump's involvement in that original investigation, meaning what did Donald Trump know about Jeffrey Epstein at the time of the first police investigation that might have helped with that particular investigation? So, there's all kinds of new disclosures that we're learning from these emails.
And I think you got a real glimpse into Jeffrey Epstein's, obviously his perspective on President Trump, but his tone, his coziness with certain journalists, his relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell. I mean, what did you learn about Jeffrey Epstein through these emails that you didn't know about before, or maybe perhaps surprised you?
Well, I think if anything, the emails may have reinforced what I learned in my investigation from my book about the spider with Jeffrey Epstein. And that was that Jeffrey Epstein always believed that he was smarter than everybody else. And he was an extremely brilliant individual when it came to money managing, estate planning, mathematics, and finances. He did save billionaires a lot of money through the way he was able to craft their tax strategy and so forth. But Jeffrey Epstein also believed two things. One was that he was smarter than everybody else. And two, that he knew the inside dirt about everybody else. And he was constantly collecting. He was a collector of people, particularly of important people, whether they were in politics, like former President Clinton, or whether they were the heads of Harvard University, like Larry Summers, or individuals in the science community, members of the royal family like Prince Andrew, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Jeffrey Epstein was a collector of people, and he was always trying to draw information out from those individuals that he could pocket away. And as I wrote in my book, I believe he also used that information to blackmail very important individuals. So the emails to me, in terms of the mocking Donald Trump, talking about his intelligence, disparaging him, really played into Jeffrey Epstein's personality, that he was smarter than everybody else, particularly Donald Trump, and that he knew inside secrets about Donald Trump that he could pass along to the Russians or other individuals. So it did reinforce how I viewed his personality.
And to that point about his Rolodex, I mean, he knew just household name after household name. Former President Bill Clinton does come up in these emails. Jeffrey Epstein says he was never at the island. Prince Andrew has faced backlash from his relationship or alleged relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, he was recently stripped of his royal titles. He was kicked out of the Royal Lodge. Did you learn anything about either of those two in these emails that you didn't know so far?
Well, former President Clinton had claimed long ago that he never visited the island, and there was a lot of speculation whether he had accompanied Jeffrey Epstein to the island in the Virgin Islands, Little St. Jeff's, that Epstein owned, and where, in fact, a lot of the sex trafficking of underage girls took place. Epstein did clarify in the emails that Clinton never visited the island. So that was something specific. In terms of Prince Andrew, you had some panicked emails from Prince Andrew to Jeffrey Epstein. At the time, Virginia was speaking out publicly for the first time in 2011. And you could sense from the emails the panic that Prince Andrew must have been going through when this woman was putting Prince Andrew into an international sex trafficking scandal at the time. And as we learned later on from additional emails that surfaced in the English newspapers, is that Prince Andrew had said that when all this was going on, that he had taken a trip to New York to basically cut all ties with Jeffrey Epstein. And then we found out from these emails that Prince Andrew was actually continuing to communicate with Jeffrey Epstein well after he said he had cut off communication. And I do believe that it was those emails that had recently been obtained by English newspapers that really forced his brother, King Charles, to sever all ties with Prince Andrew, because it showed that he was completely lying in that infamous train wreck TV interview he had given over in London some years back.
And I do want to move on and talk about Ghislaine Maxwell, because the most damning email, or one of the most damning emails that surfaced yesterday, was sent to her. I'll read it again in full. This was in 2011. Epstein sent this. I want you to realize that that dog that hasn't barked is Trump, redacted, victim one, who House Republicans said was Virginia Giuffre, spent hours at my house with him. He has never once been mentioned. And Maxwell responds, I have been thinking about that. But over the summer, it doesn't really seem like she was thinking about that, especially during her interview with the DOJ, because she said she never saw any concerning behavior with Trump. He was always a gentleman in all respects. She said that Trump and Epstein didn't really have a super close friendship, and that she herself never saw him at Epstein's house. Do you think that, based on what we saw in these emails, that shows that Ghislaine Maxwell was lying?
Oh, I absolutely do. It is in direct conflict to what she had told Todd Blanche in this interview. And the interview really was nothing more, as far as I'm concerned, than an infomercial to basically lay the groundwork for a pardon from President Trump by her expressing over and over again what a great guy Trump was, and the fact that she never saw any type of wrongdoing on his part. I do think now that the Oversight Committee needs to subpoena her and to bring her in and to question her specifically, Brittany, about that particular email that you just read in full, but also some of the other emails that put President Trump inside of Jeffrey Epstein's home, and also Jeffrey Epstein says to Michael Wolff at one point in one of the emails that Donald Trump told Ghislaine to stop. Now, I take that to be stop taking girls from the Mar-a-Lago spa that she was taking, like Virginia, to Epstein for these sexualized massages. So she needs to answer to all of this, because she claims that she was never part of any wrongdoing, that she never saw any wrongdoing. And these emails specifically contradict what she said to Todd Blanche, and also contradict what she said in depositions that she's given over the years. So I do think that the Oversight Committee needs to act, and they need to act fast in an attempt or in a request to the Justice Department to bring her in and take her to task on these specific emails.
After the interview that Ghislaine Maxwell had with Todd Blanche, we then saw her transferred to what has been described as a cushy prison facility. And Julie Brown, she's a reporter with the Miami Herald, and for years she has tirelessly reported on the Epstein story. And she has some recent reporting on a letter that Congressman Jamie Raskin sent to President Trump. And I want to read parts of that letter. In that letter, Raskin says that Ghislaine Maxwell is working on a commutation application. He also reveals that inside that cushy prison, that federal law enforcement staff working there have been, quote, waiting on Ms. Maxwell hand and foot. He also quoted a top official there saying that he's, quote, sick of having to be Maxwell's bitch. Raskin then posed this question to President Trump. What information is Ms. Maxwell agreeing to suppress in order to receive such outlandishly favorable treatment as a federal prisoner and convicted sex offender? What do you think the answer is there? And based on the emails that have been released, did we learn anything in there that could answer that question?
I don't think we learned anything from the emails. The emails ended in 2019. But I do think that Maxwell's situation right now, having been moved to this minimum security dormitory type facility in Bryan, Texas, from the lockup, the federal lockup she was in Florida, is absolutely a quid pro quo in the sense that the government is taking care of Maxwell right now. And it's disgusting. I can tell you this, in speaking to some of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's victims, for her to be treated the way she's being treated and waited on as she is by the warden there and others is revolting. She's a convicted of sex trafficking of minors. She shouldn't, first of all, according to the Bureau of Prisons guidelines, she shouldn't be in the facility that she's in. And I've attempted to reach officials with the Bureau of Prisons several times about this, and no one is talking. To me, this is something that came out of her interview with Todd Blanche. It's absolutely wrong. The victims are horrified over the treatment that she's receiving right now. And they're so fearful that President Trump is going to pardon her or give her a reduced sentence. Of course, he has the right to do that. And we know that she recently requested that. But I do think if there was something that was positive that came out of the release yesterday of these emails from Jeffrey Epstein's estate to the Oversight Committee, it's the fact that now there's even more publicity around this, and it is disgusting to the American public as to some of the things that Jeffrey Epstein said about Donald Trump in these emails. And I'm hoping that this public outcry now will stop an attempt by Ghislaine Maxwell to receive a pardon from President Trump. But again, at the end of the day, he marches to his own drummer. He'll make whatever decision he wants. But I think that if he were to give Maxwell a pardon, it would appear to the public that he is guilty of something, that he is trying to hide something, and that's why he's being nice to this woman.
And could you imagine the public outcry if he pardoned Ghislaine Maxwell or commuted her sentence? Because she is a convicted sex offender. What she's accused of is disgusting across party lines to almost every American. It should be disgusting to every single American. And I'm curious, this may be a very simple question, but there have been calls now for years, release the Epstein Files. Are these the Epstein Files? I know people want a client list, but we're seeing names being dropped in these emails. Do you think that this is enough? I mean, what makes this different from what people call the Epstein Files?
Well, the Epstein files are the FBI files that the government has held. They released some documents over the years, but nothing to a degree where there's specific references to Trump beyond being in the address book and the flight logs. There's 100,000 pages of documents that are results of interviews with victims, information about possible investigations into third parties, men that enabled Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking, fixers who put young girls on planes and to have them arrive in the Virgin Islands to be abused by Jeffrey Epstein. There's a wealth of information in those files that could give us the complete picture of the government's effort to seek justice, not only against Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, but possibly others in their web of criminality. The files or the emails that were turned over, that we're discussing today, were turned over by Jeffrey Epstein's estate. The estate has additional materials. Not all of that information has been in the hands of the FBI. And it is only now under complete subpoena from the Oversight Committee that the Jeffrey Epstein estate has been providing additional materials to the Oversight Committee. And so from the emails, I've learned the names of upwards of 100 new men that should be investigated for possible participation in sex trafficking with Jeffrey Epstein. And there were some coded emails that were very, very disturbing. One man wrote to Jeffrey Epstein, when I visit, should I bring the secret cake from New York? To me, that was some type of code or signal in terms of bringing a girl to him. If you read between the lines, there's some very disturbing information that Jeffrey Epstein was discussing with some of these men. So it really does open the door to the fact that we need the Justice Department to look into each and every name that's come across from these emails, and each of these individuals need to be interviewed. And if there's crimes, then they need to be prosecuted. And we need to see if in the Epstein Files, there's any type of cooperation from other victims. So, to me, this has opened up a hornet's nest of new information for investigators. But my biggest fear is that we're dealing with the Trump administration here. And for the most part, they have stated that there's nothing to see in these files. That's why they said they were not going to release them this past July. So I really wonder if we'll ever see any type of justice in this particular case as long as Donald Trump remains in office.
And to that point, President Trump, since these emails have been released, he called this a hoax. The White House press secretary said that these emails prove absolutely nothing other than the fact that President Trump did nothing wrong. That's what she said once the House Democrats released those emails. But just yesterday, that discharge petition had enough signatures where next week there's expected to be rather, a vote that would compel the Trump administration to release all the files related to Jeffrey Epstein. But what do you think the likelihood of that happening is? Because even if that passed the House, it would still need to pass the Republican majority in the Senate. And then President Trump himself would have to sign that into law. What's the likelihood of us seeing all of the Epstein files, any and everything related to him?
Well, Brittany, I know that I was in Washington, D.C. over at the end of the summer when Jeffrey Epstein victims marched on Capitol Hill and held a press conference demanding the release of the Epstein files. And I know that they're going back to Washington again next week to hold a second press conference. But at the end of the day, I'm afraid that their cries are going to fall on deaf ears, because I don't think at the end of the day, Donald Trump, based on the statements that he's made, based on the statements that his Attorney General Pam Bondi has made, the FBI Director Kash Patel, that they plan on releasing these files to the public. So this is going to be something that is going to continue to hang over their heads for the rest of this administration. And Jeffrey Epstein is going to continue to haunt Donald Trump from his grave. I think that the likelihood of seeing the files released, the odds are very, very low at this point that this administration is going to do that, even though they promised more transparency in this administration to the public than in any past administration. And we may have to wait for a Democratic administration to come into office before we see these files.
And do you think that this is going to ruin President Trump's legacy or reputation, however anyone views that? Because the Access Hollywood tapes certainly did not. He was elected to president twice after that. January 6th didn't. He then won the election in 2024. I mean, do you think that his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein does it for people?
Well, I think from what we saw in the summer, this was the very first time that there had been a splintering in his MAGA base, where there were many members of MAGA, public figures, who said that these files need to be released because they're secrets that the government is holding from the public. So I do think that this is something that is going to continue to swirl. And I do think it's always going to haunt his legacy because the public really wants to know what took place with Jeffrey Epstein, who was a sex trafficker of underage girls. And yes, we saw the Access Hollywood tape. I wrote a book called All the President's Women, Donald Trump and the Making of a Predator, going into detail about the allegations that were lodged by more than 24 women against him. But this is different. This deals with sex trafficking of minors, and it is something, to me, that's a line, regardless of what side of the aisle that you vote on, that it is something that good people, that Americans think is something that is absolutely disgusting, that is absolutely criminal. And the fact that you have a sitting president who's had a past with this, a friendship for 15 years with this individual, and now we're seeing emails from Jeffrey Epstein talking about Trump's knowledge of what went on behind the scenes, is particularly disturbing.
And my last question to you, because these emails really seem to open a Pandora's box here. Like you said, it was like opening a hornet's nest. I'm curious because, as you also said, this was one of the most consequential days in everything related to Epstein that you've ever covered from start to finish. What specifically are you looking out for next in terms of the answers to the biggest questions that you have?
Well, I do think that if we had access to the Jeffrey Epstein FBI files, that we could see if there's actual cooperation in there in terms of what are the references to Donald Trump in those files, and are they damaging? Are they embarrassing? And until we actually see all the information, right now we're still seeing very small pieces of the puzzle. We need to see that puzzle put together in its entirety. And until we know that, we're never going to know the real truth about what went on behind closed doors between Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump. And it is important because this man is the most powerful individual in the world right now, sitting in the Oval Office now for a second time. And I think as a voter in America, we should be demanding that the government release these files, particularly in complete transparency to every single reference to Donald Trump in these FBI files.
Barry, I always appreciate your expertise. I've leaned on your reporting and your investigative work so much when I talk about Epstein and everything related to his criminal network. So thank you a million times over. You're welcome back anytime. I hope you can come back soon.
Well, when there's new developments, we'll definitely talk. And hopefully that new development will be by some type of miracle that the government is going to release those files. And then we can dig in and see what's actually in there.